Hello, my name's Dave, and this is the first in what I hope will be a series of videos that I make about the literature of the language Esperanto. If you're not familiar, Esperanto is a language that was created by a man named Zamenhof in the late 1800s, and the idea was that it would be an international auxiliary language. So everybody in the world would learn it as their second language. And because it was everybody's second language, everybody would be on a level playing field, at least linguistically speaking. And as a result of that, it would foster world peace and mutual understanding between cultures and that sort of thing. Now that aspect of it didn't really interest me, to be honest. Not to sound shallow, but I think people will find plenty of other reasons to kill each other besides language differences, and so while interesting and noble a goal, it didn't really draw me to the language. But what did, it was when I learned that the language had a rich history of literature, and I found that particularly interesting, that an quote-unquote artificial language would have that sort of material, and it turns out that that's been the case ever since the creation of the language. Zamenhof himself, to demonstrate the quality and the usability of the language in his day, he began by translating great works of literature, Shakespeare and Moliere and so on, and that torch has been passed basically from generation to generation since Zamenhof himself, both translating literature but also creating original literature, poetry and prose, originally written in Esperanto. And I found it interesting enough that I tried to find something that had been translated from Esperanto into English, at least initially, which I found pretty hard to do, actually. The two books I found most readily available were memoirs of a man named Tivadar Soros, who was the father of famous investor George Soros. Tivadar was an famous Esperantist of his day, at least in Esperanto circles, and he lived through both world wars and wrote his memoirs about his experiences that he published in Esperanto, and those were recently translated into English by a man named Humphrey Tonkin, and that was about it. That was pretty much all I could find, and it was kind of frustrating. I went to several language forums online that I frequent, and asked about it, tried to get some guidance, and to be honest, nobody really helped me very much. I didn't get a whole lot of detail. The one solid piece of advice that I got was to pick up this book, which I did, called The Concise Encyclopedia of the Original Literature of Esperanto. And it's not concise, as you can see. It's pretty thick, but it's a great resource. It's a little bit misleading, actually, the length, because it's meant to be a reference work primarily, and so you wouldn't read it from cover to cover. But it does have several sections that are summaries of the different identified periods in Esperanto literary history, and it talks about the various writers of each period and the important works and so on. And that's really interesting. It also has a section about the linguistic properties of Esperanto that make it unique and interesting as a literary medium, which I found to be an interesting read as well. And then just even opening it up to a random page and reading about somebody and what they wrote and so forth has been really interesting. So it's a great resource, and it's written in English, so you don't need to know the language to read it, which is great. But that's it. And this is pretty daunting to see. You know, if you have kind of a casual interest, and you know, somebody says, "Well, go read this 700-page book," you're going to scare off a lot of people, and I think that's kind of a shame. because for me anyways, and I suspect for other people like me that are literary and big readers, and that's their primary motivation for learning a language, it's an amazing and compelling reason to learn the language. And it's not being, in my opinion, it's not being focused on as much as it should be. Instead of the world peace argument and so on, which I don't particularly find a compelling reason to learn the language, though it's a noble goal and I hope it happens. I don't. It certainly isn't motivating me to learn Esperanto. So I hope by making these videos I can provide a resource to make it easier for people like me who have stumbled upon Esperanto and want to learn more about its literature, especially if that's a deciding factor about whether they want to learn the language or not, so that they don't have to read this book. They can see my videos and be able to make an informed decision based on that, rather than dismissing the language based on the common popular pejorative arguments that you see about it. A lot of stuff that you read about Esperanto that is negative tends to criticize its rather naive ideology that's associated with it, which I think to a certain extent is a fair criticism, but is these days is really a criticism of a small segment, it seems, of the Esperanto population, and hopefully that these videos will give a more balanced viewpoint that can encourage you to check out the literature. So check out some of my forthcoming videos where I will discuss in more detail the different books that I have, and name names and tell you what's interesting and what I found interesting and what's worth reading. So see you again.